Racism has become the front and center issue in America, starting with the death of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer a few months ago. Today, cities burn as rioters join with protesters with the single objective of overthrowing our system of government. Black Lives Matter, or BLM, dominates the airwaves. Where is the Church of Jesus Christ in the midst of all this? Hard to say. Many pastors are perplexed about exactly how to address all this. I have a few thoughts to consider on the other side. Back in a moment.
Welcome to Minister's Toolbox, providing leaders with the tools they need to succeed in ministry. Now, here's your host, Casey Sabella.
Full disclosure, I belong to the category Caucasian. The dictionary defines Caucasian as having European ancestry classified according to light skin pigmentation. It doesn't sound very exciting, but okay. In today's culture, it also means that I'm a racist, unless proven otherwise in the court of public opinion. I am being a little sarcastic, but there may be more truth in that statement than we want to acknowledge. I titled this podcast, The Language of Racism, because I think as leaders, we need to get down to some basics no one wants to talk about. By the language of racism, I'm not referring necessarily to the N-word, but the A-word. Now you're perplexed, so rather than string your curiosity along, by the A-word, I mean African American. In this country, we identify black people as African Americans. I'm not sure why we do that. It's a stupid thing to do. Even referring to people as black is sort of stupid too, but I'll need a little time to explain. My great-grandfather on my father's side came over from Sicily in the early part of the last century. For those who are uninitiated, Sicilians generationally have always been considered by other Italians as the bottom feeders of their race. Sicily has been conquered numerous times throughout the centuries. As a result, they are not considered pure Italians. And here you thought that only Germans believed in a master race. In any case, my great-grandfather came to America, worked on the railroads, and raised a family. My grandfather, Charles, was born in America. He was an American. My father was born in America. He was an American. I was born in America. I am an American. Perhaps you're seeing a pattern here. On my mother's side, my great-grandfather came over from Ireland, as did my grandmother. When they became citizens of America, you could say they were Irish Americans. My grandmother had an Irish brogue. She became an American citizen, but it would not be odd to refer to her as Irish American. My mother, born here, was American, and so forth. Now, tracing my heritage, I am a composite of Irish, Sicilian, and some German thrown in there for good measure. That fact, though somewhat interesting to me, is irrelevant. I'm an American. Who knew you would get a civics lessons on a minister's podcast? But bear with me. Why do we refer to people with dark skin as African American? It is an ignorant, and I would say even racist thing to proclaim. Do you know the national heritage of every dark-skinned person you meet? No more than you would know my heritage by looking at me. I've been to Africa numerous times. First of all, Africa is a continent, but it is not united like our country in terms of government. Egypt is a country in Africa. So are South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Sudan, and Morocco. In fact, there are 54 countries in Africa. To accurately label someone African American usually requires a fair amount of research. On balance, very few people in these United States can legitimately be called African Americans. In most cases, like my mother or my father, they are simply Americans. They were born here. So under that reality, they are American. So why do we call people with dark skin pigmentation African American? I was speaking with a member of our church the other day. She became an American citizen after coming here from Jamaica years ago. She will be forever identified as African American. That is a language of racism. Why do we need to place people in separate categories at all? We identify people as black, or in rare cases, white. Folks, other than albinos, there are simply no white people. The majority of humans throughout the world are different shades of brown. Some, quote, white people are so light their skin may have elements of pink or red, but for the most part, light brown. There are very few black people in America. Very few. If you were to join me in Zimbabwe, where we're building wells, I could show you several black people. But even then, perhaps half of the residents can legitimately be considered black. What does pigmentation have to do with how we relate to each other? I will tell you. Nothing. If you were born in America, you are, newsflash, an American. Duh. So why do we refer to people as, quote, black or white? That is a pigmentation, not a citizenship label. Why do, quote, white people refer to, quote, black people as African American? How do we know their country of origin? Why do you need to use color to identify a person at all? Black Lives Matter has become the rallying cry to defeat racism. And I'm about to say something that will probably upset most of you. Black Lives Matter is a bastardization of the English language. What do I mean by that? Black Lives Matter is a rather obvious statement. Anyone with even a slight amount of common sense would agree that all black lives matter. I would go further to say even black lives in the womb matter, but I won't go there right now. Black Lives Matter is also an organization. It is an anti-Christ, pro-Marxist movement that directly supports the communist takeover of our government. That may sound overdramatic, but if you've studied communism as I have with respect to Russia, formerly called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, the patterns of ideology and tactics are identical. These same tactics were employed in China, Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and other nations when their countries were conquered by communism. You begin with an identifiable, oppressed minority. You advocate for the violent overthrow of that government. You establish a dictator with a strong military to keep them in power, and the formerly oppressed people stay not only oppressed, but demonstrably poorer for generations. Those in power acquire billions of dollars in property and privileges. The military becomes the middle class of society, and everyone else is relegated to poverty status. The government controls all media, all businesses, and, in essence, all life. Take a look at Zimbabwe or Venezuela. 60 years ago, Zimbabwe was the second fastest growing economy in the world. Today, it is a communist government with people starving in abject poverty, while government officials live in luxury. Venezuela, only a few years ago, was known as the crown jewel of South America. Today, it's a hellhole. Why? The embracing of the Antichrist philosophy of Marxism. It always produces the same result. The conservative clergy of color, 500-plus pastors, have come out to publicly push back against the false and destructive narratives of the, quote, vicious mob of malcontents, end of quote, known as the Black Lives Matter movement. I'll have a link in today's show notes if you want to read more about their coalition. Why are, quote, black pastors coming against Black Lives Matter? Because just using the language of inclusion doesn't mean that the organization is something worth supporting. In my state, businesses are falling over each other to support Black Lives Matter. It is sick, in my opinion. They just want to get on the bandwagon to show everyone how non-racist they are. But by so doing, they're revealing the opposite. Just because the organization says Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that those words identify their objectives. For my part, I will do everything in my power to oppose this Marxist and evil organization. Because of the way we misuse language, I might easily be termed a racist. That wouldn't be the first time I've been labeled, and it won't be the last. As a church leader, I am willing to have a dialogue with anyone about race or understanding people better, about connecting with people from different points of view, or any other subject. Mutual respect is the environment that makes that happen. The church, in my opinion, needs to speak a clearer message to the world about our gospel. You know, racism is not a new concept. Acts chapter 6 is entirely about racism. So is Galatians chapters 1 and 2. If you travel to any part of the world, you'll discover racism in every culture, and many times skin pigmentation has nothing to do with it. Racism is all about insecurity and the sinful need of one group of people to dominate another group of people. Even though my father was a third-generation Sicilian, he was excluded from many groups because he was a wop, a guinea, a greaseball. Oh yeah, these racial epithets have been around for centuries. The church is better than that. Paul put it this way, and this is God's plan. Both Gentiles and Jews who believe the good news share equally in the riches inherited by God's children. Both are part of the same body, and both enjoy the promise of blessings because they belong to Christ Jesus. That's from Ephesians chapter 3, verse 6. We never consider how powerful these words were in his day. Jews despised Gentiles. They were taught from youth that the only purpose for Gentiles was to fuel the fires of hell. Paul was raised to hate Gentiles as barbarians and the scum of the earth. How fitting that God revealed his plan to a former racist. The plan is that all people, everywhere, are equal partakers of the riches of Christ. That is the end of racism of any kind for all Christ followers. It concerns me that churches align themselves with BLM and any organization that claims moral superiority. We need to remain aligned with the gospel alone. If God leads you or your church to fight any injustice in the culture, make sure that you keep your alliances clean. As I said, BLM has zero to do with the cause of Christ, even though the name itself seems just. The church ought to be the place for racial reconciliation. I've been in Caucasian churches and churches of color, which is another way of saying darker skin, and witnessed absurd racist statements from the pulpit. As leaders, God holds us accountable for the positions we espouse from the pulpit. It is long overdue that leaders speak with one voice rather than the voices of organizations run by unbelievers. Just some thoughts to consider today. As I mentioned, I'll have a link in the show notes for the article from the Conservative Clergy of Color. It's well worth the read. Next week, I'll interview Steve Hinton, author of the book called Confessions. Steve has a passion for church leaders to live authentically. But until then, I end this podcast with a quote especially for you. This one, appropriately, is from Martin Luther King, who said, "I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word." Until next time.
For more resources, go to ministerstoolbox.com. Thanks for listening.